The flood, which was not planet-wide, occurred in approximately 2350 BC. After the flood, Noah and the other occupants of the ark spread, by word of mouth, details about the flood and the ark. It was a major event, and they probably never stopped talking about it. Noah and his descendants eventually encountered people who had survived the flood, people who had been outside of the flood zone. The descendants of Noah spoke to those people. From there, details about the ark and the animals that had been on the ark spread by word of mouth. And always remember that some people who had lived immediately outside of the flood zone were aware of the flood during the flood. One thing that we may never know is what the flood boundary looked like from immediately outside of the flood zone. Whatever it looked like, it must have been a sight to see. And before the flood subsided in Genesis chapter 8, people who witnessed the flood boundary must have began spreading their accounts of the flood. Perhaps the oldest known spoken account of the flood is in Job 22:15 through 16. Eliphaz was the speaker. That spoken account was not actually written until the book of Job was written. Of course, we do not know when Eliphaz spoke in Job 22:15 through 16, and we do not know when the book of Job was written. However, suppose that in the year 1870 BC, Eliphaz gave his Job 22:15 through 16 flood account. If so, then that date would be rather significant in one respect. Consider the Babylonian cuneiform clay tablet that Irving Finkel decoded. See the book that Irving Finkel wrote, The Ark Before Noah, Decoding the Story of the Flood. Suppose that that clay tablet was written in the year 1850 BC. If so, then that would mean that 20 years before that clay tablet was written, Eliphaz gave his spoken account of the flood. However, we really do not know the exact dates of the Eliphaz spoken account or that Babylonian cuneiform clay tablet. But always remember that that clay tablet was written approximately 500 years after the flood. That clay tablet dates to approximately 1850 BC, and the flood occurred in approximately 2350 BC. Just imagine how many people spoke about the flood after the flood. Imagine how much word of mouth spread the news in the space of 500 years. Some accurate details were spread, some fictional details were added, and so several flood stories arose initially from the Mesopotamian Babylonian region. Historians know that to be a fact. But always remember that non-biblical flood myths contain fictional elements. As for Eliphaz, he was very brief in Job 22:15 through 16. Nothing that Eliphaz spoke in Job 22:15 through 16 was fictional. But flood myths contain a mix of fictional elements that are mixed with some level of truth. Don't let that surprise you. Some of us still teach that Columbus discovered that the world was round, and some of us still teach that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. History gets mixed with myth, and then the truth gets clouded for people who are unable to precisely distinguish between history and legend. That's life. Some confusion has been spread by using the fact that the book of Genesis was not written until nearly 1,000 years after the flood. During that huge time span, other writers wrote flood myths. A couple of flood myths were written before Moses wrote the book of Genesis. Consequently, some people claim that the flood account in Genesis is just a spin-off of flood myths that predated the writing of Genesis. But always remember that those flood myths did not predate the flood itself, which occurred in circa 2350 BC. After the flood, people started talking about the flood, and the rest is history, mixed with fiction, in the case of non-biblical flood myths. There was that Babylonian cuneiform clay tablet that Irving Finkel decoded, and there was the flood in the Sumerian Eridu, the Gilgamesh flood tablet 11. Both of those myths were written hundreds of years after the flood, and both of those myths were written before Moses wrote the book of Genesis. That does not mean that Genesis is a spin-off of those flood myths. That means that people were talking about an actual flood after the actual flood. There are flood myths from around the world, but the earliest myths spread from the region in which the flood actually occurred. And that fact makes perfect sense. And that fact actually supports the doctrine that the flood was just a local flood. Think about it. If the flood was planet-wide, then Noah and his descendants would have been the only people to spread news by word of mouth. But in reality, the flood was just a local flood. Some people in that part of the world began spreading the news of the flood before Noah and his family exited the ark. And then Noah's descendants spread news about the ark and the animals that had been on the ark. The Babylonian cuneiform clay tablet that Irving Finkel decoded records that animals went 2 by 2 onto a round ship that floated on the flood waters, and that clay tablet records that some humans survived by getting on that round ship, and that clay tablet reports that a Mesopotamian god gave instructions for building that large round ship. Truth got mixed with fiction. If you want to read the completely true story, read Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 8, and read the rest of the Holy Bible. Jesus Christ is Lord.